Well, welcome to Everyday Anarchism, and my guest today is my personal favorite writer about football or soccer, David Goldblatt. David, thank you for joining me.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, David, I asked you to come on the show. I'm going to air this episode right around the beginning of the World Cup, so I wanted to spend some time talking about the Qatar World Cup, which I'm still ambivalent about whether I will even be watching, but also just the sort of troubling takeover by this game of football, it seems to me, by whatever you want to call it, capitalism, neoliberalism, whatever this centralized neo-colonial grasping, environment destroying world order that we have, it seems to have in many ways captured soccer or football. I'm sorry, I'm going to probably use both terms interchangeably. And it seems like the Super League and the Qatar World Cup are both just excellent examples of this trend, when it also seems to me that what's wonderful about football is the way that it is a game that everyone plays, that anyone can play. And I see football as it's consumed on television in the United States, especially, as moving further and further away from this dream of soccer as we want it to be. So I guess that's my opening gambit, and you can pick up and run with whatever part you wish.
So I think, first of all, on the colonization of football by capital, of course, historically, economic forces and economic institutions have been a presence in football since professionalization came along and people were being paid under the counter. And that has taken many forms over the last 140, 150 years. But I think it is fair to say that since the arrival of the internet and satellite television and pay-per-view television, the amount of money in the game, and not just from television, but from all of the innumerable ancillary industries, from betting to sportswear, that are dependent upon it, is in a completely different space. We've reached the point where the European football industry is now worth more than the European publishing industry. Wow. I find completely extraordinary. And that certainly wasn't the case a decade or two ago. But alongside that, and I think, although interlinked, should be thought of as a separate kind of power and a separate kind of colonization, has been the presence of political institutions and political projects in football. And again, nothing entirely new. The 34 World Cup was Mussolini's, the 78 World Cup was the junta's. Silvio Berlusconi kind of wrote the playbook in the late 1980s and turned cultural capital at Milan into eventually, becoming Prime Minister of Italy. But over the last 20 years, 25 years, I think, again, we've seen a step change in the scale and level of intervention across the world. We live in an era where the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party has made it an official marker of development that China will achieve Xi Jinping's 3 wishes, that China will qualify again for the Men's World Cup, host the Men's World Cup, and by 2050 win the World Cup. Argentina, in recent years, the government actually nationalized the television rights of the top league and put it out for free on cable television, accompanied by an enormous quantity of government advertising. So, across the world, that you literally can't name a country now anymore where politics and football are not at some level intertwined, and that political power is making its presence felt. So in that regard, the Qatar World Cup is a fitting World Cup for this age of football. It is on a scale, economic and political, that exceeds anything that has come before. Economically, Qatar has spent, at a conservative estimate, $250 billion on the infrastructure program that has occurred parallel to the World Cup, much of which, of course, would have occurred without the World Cup, but the World Cup has given it a kind of focus and direction and kind of catalyzed the scale of it. And $250 billion, just to put it in perspective, is significantly more than all of the World Cups and all of the Olympic Games ever all put together. It's kind of Bangladesh's GDP. And, you know, Qatar also believes, you know, and argues that in the post-hydrocarbon world that it acknowledges that it is coming, sport in general and football in particular will be an element of whatever this post-hydrocarbon economy is going to look like in Qatar. So there's a lot economically riding on it. And then politically, lots of states have used football and hosted tournaments as a form of soft power. But Qatar is in a completely different terrain on the scale and the sophistication of what it has attempted to do. I mean, winning the World Cup in a sense is, you know, like a completely extraordinary play that they managed. But, you know, the money they've invested in their own league, the creation of the Aspire Academy, the sifting of maybe 5 million young players across Africa and Asia with a view to bringing them to the Aspire Academy, the scouting and tutoring of every single last Qatari child, for football skills, the creation of beIN Sports, which is the dominant sports and football broadcaster in the Arab world, a very significant presence, and with political and cultural tentacles more widely. And that's not to mention, you know, the 150 other major sporting events, from the Asian Cup to the World Club Cup to the Tour of Qatar cycling event that's been hosted over the last 10 or 15 years. So that's pretty extraordinary. I mean, most, you know, and again, it's interesting that they focused it on, you know, football. This is not just about an elite project, which many forms of soft power are, you know, and diplomacy and aid programs and so on. But you know, this is the world's game. And, you know, it makes a lot of sense because Qatar is a small, vulnerable, small peninsula stuck on the backside of Saudi Arabia, which has never reconciled it really to its independence. It has the UAE looking crossly at it from the east, and it has Iran and Iraq and all of that instability immediately to its north. What are you going to do? Well, obviously, you know, you build the Americans' gigantic airbase from which most kind of aerial activity in Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq has been launched for the last decade or so. And you make yourself visible. You make yourself known. And, you know, art, tourism, all of that stuff's great, but like nothing comes close. Nothing comes close to football. So it is absolutely central to Qatar's foreign policy and to its infrastructural and development policy. So that's like new territory. So in that regard, yeah, however, whatever one thinks of it, or however one wants to judge these things, it is definitely a World Cup for our age. The European Super League, I'm not sure that is.
If you want to take a little bit more time with the Qatar World Cup and see if we get to the Super League, it's up to you.
Sure. Okay. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the Qatar World Cup and another of its superlatives is that it is, of course, the first in a Muslim majority Arabic speaking country. And if football's kind of cosmopolitan and universalistic claims to mean anything, this must be considered a good thing in and of itself. Perhaps in a kind of alternative parallel universe, you know, we'd be having a peaceful celebration of cosmopolitanism in the joint Iran-Iraq World Cup, or maybe a Levantine one that crossed Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, where football is also, you know, maniacally popular. But that's not happening. So that seems to me a good thing. I think the second thing is that this is going to be the most watched World Cup ever. I mean, really, the numbers, I think, are going to be more extraordinary than ever. You know, the three largest countries in the world, China, India, and the US. 20 years ago, football's still a pretty marginal popular cultural phenomena. It is now increasingly significant in all of them, with an ever increasing viewership, particularly for something like the World Cup. And of course, you know, technology is ubiquitous. Access to these things is ever easier. And it was interesting to note that Russia 2018 was a 40% of the audience were women. And that's a marked rise. And I think that's just going to continue. So I think the audience, I don't think anyone will have ever watched, you know, personal boycotts aside, I don't think anyone will ever have watched anything as much as this World Cup. And of course, it's in a Northern Hemisphere winter. So that's disappointing in the Northern Hemisphere, in all of the outdoor gatherings that have increasingly become a feature of World Cups. And I think one of the kind of nicest things about them actually is that the World Cup increasingly happens not just in the stadiums or people's homes, but in kind of public spaces, in parks, in bars, in kind of warehouses, you know, where people kind of gather to watch the thing collectively. Obviously, there'll be less of that in the Northern Hemisphere because of you know, the winter basically. But there we are. It's better than playing in 45 degrees centigrade, which is what we'd be looking at if it was played in June and July when FIFA originally said okay to the project. So they're all really interesting. Yeah, they're interesting things about it. But of course, it's a really controversial World Cup. Partly because it is so many things to be controversial about, but it's also, I think this is worth noting, certainly compared to Russia 2018 or Beijing 2022 Olympics, Qatar's relatively open, you know, for foreign journalists, even though they're slapping all sorts of film permit controls on people, and journalists have had a difficult time. But compared to like Russia or like dealing with the Uyghur areas of China, you know, it's been much more open. So I think you've had much more critical scrutiny than you had, and there was a lot to be critical about Russia in 2018. You know, North Korean slave labor, massively corrupt stadium programs, huge demonstrations against welfare reform during the World Cup, but made invisible in non-World Cup cities. I mean, I could go on, but barely any of this registers. Qatar also cares what people think. I mean, that was the point of the project. The Russians and the Chinese, they didn't give a shit in the end. You can make all the criticisms you like in the liberal global north, but like, it doesn't make any difference. They don't care. But Qatar cares. So it has a kind of, that stokes the fires. And I think it's also the case that while one of the consequences of formal political power taking so much of an interest in global football is that lots of other people have cottoned onto this, that there is an archipelago of resistance, of critical thinking, of challenges from below, you know, from fan organized stuff, from investigative journalists, from human rights organizations. There's so much more of that than there was 20, 25 years ago. And, you know, Human Rights Watch and The Guardian and Amnesty International have run very effective bits of research and very effective campaigns across the board and kept this thing, kept the critical flame burning. So it's a shame, not a shame, but it's just notable that nothing has had this level of scrutiny. Even Beijing 2008, you know, which had all sorts of good reasons to be critical of it. In the end, no one could get inside China, not really. But this is different. So, you know, what are the debates here? Okay, first of all, did they buy it? You know, how did they get it? And it's like the Sunday Times said they did in their investigation. Qatar says no, we didn't. And I say we know how politics worked at FIFA in 2010. I mean, we knew anyway, but the FIFA Gate revelations made it all transparently clear. We know that no World Cup has, no World Cup has got has been awarded without some kind of business being done since France 1998. So why would Qatar be any different? Why would Russia 2018 be any different?
So you can correct me on this, but if I remember correctly, FIFA more or less admitted that there was irregularities, and then they were just like too late, though, or something like that. I mean,
well, it's irregularities. There was a lavish campaign, by both the Russians and the Qataris, target all the usual suspects. FIFA's own, infrastructure and kind of, official report on the Qatar bid said, it's great, but it's mad. You can't play here in the summer. And people just went ahead and went, yeah, whatever. And thus necessitating the entire rewriting of the global football calendar for like a 3-4 year cycle. Then there's the alcohol issue. Some people have got a problem with that. I mean, certainly in Latin America and Europe, it's the drug of choice and an essential component of elements of the culture. I have less of a problem with that. I mean, it's really not a human right to get really pissed. There will be beer. It'll be bad beer. It'll be weak beer. It won't be in the places that you want, but there will be beer, and it will have, C2H5OH in it, and it will get you pissed.
I think bad, cheap beer is the average American football game experience as well. So that's not something I'm going to be crying about either.
And it's like, I went to the Women's Euros final at Wembley this year. No one was drunk. Not a single drunk. At an England-Germany game, it was great. I absolutely loved it. Nobody stuck a flare up their arse. Nobody was a coked up maniac screaming in my face. And it was a really amazing atmosphere. I mean, I'm not a prohibitionist, everybody should be able to have a drink. But actually, I think the low alcohol model of football, it's got something going for it, I would say. And then there's the rights issues. I mean, again, homosexuality is illegal. And for all the kind of, welcome vibes, everyone will be welcome vibes, LGBT folk definitely feeling worried and concerned about the policing of their sexuality. Women's rights have really, common practice is not a billion miles from where Saudi Arabia is, although women do hold very significant positions in cultural and educational institutions. You have a huge level of higher education amongst women in Qatar. I mean, it's a really interesting, I wonder where that social conflict's going to go. You can't send a generation of young women to university and then try and lock them into kind of the patterns of control that you have in Saudi Arabia. So I think that's a really interesting conflict quietly boiling away inside Qatar.
I think it's boiling over right now in Iran with protests that are driven by primarily, it seems, educated women who had a chance to get an education, but then were asked to, precisely to knuckle under to these patriarchal strictures. And that's happening in Iran. And it seems plausible that something like that will be happening in Qatar in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I mean, the systems of repression are very different.
Yes.
You don't have the religious police, you don't have a theocracy. It's complicated. But yeah, that's to come, I suspect. And obviously, yeah, I mean, the press thing is mixed. On the one hand, I mean, obviously, sort of, Qatar is pretty much an absolutist monarchy. Power is restricted to a very small number of people around the royal house. The democratic kind of structures that do exist, barely exist. But, like, we all went to Russia. We all went to China. I mean, I'm not saying that these are not unimportant issues. But the debate about Qatar that focuses just on Qatar for all of these things, it's like you've got to zoom out and say, okay, so what's the big picture on the staging of global events? Are we only going to Sweden? If we are, fine, but that's like then the whole world is not coming. So that doesn't work. So where do you draw the line and how do you draw the line? I mean, answers on a postcard, really. It's complicated. I'm not saying it couldn't be tighter. I mean, I just think it's also how accountable and how kind of, it's about who's kind of making decisions inside these big organizations and how they're recruited. And that's a whole nother debate about the democratization of international sports federations. So yeah, Qatar's a mix. I mean, it's much more open than, you know, reporting on China, but it also gives, you know, dissident journalists a hard time. I mean, the Qataris are a complicated old lot. You know, on the one hand, Arabic Al Jazeera, which, you know, is theirs, is a voice for, provides a voice and a platform for opinions that are just not being heard in most of the Arabic speaking world, where harsh conditions of censorship apply. On the other hand, like critiques of the Qatari state, that's not happening. And both things is like, both things true, you know. And then there's the workers' rights issue. I mean, this is a really huge and incredibly important thing. And it's been driven slightly, unfortunately, by a numbers game. And I understand why, and I'm not saying it's unimportant, but I think it kind of has slightly obscured and made the debate more untransparent than it could be. So, you know, the human rights folks are saying as early as 2013, based on, you know, projections, but looking at kind of current data, and given how many, you know, migrant workers there are in Qatar, 2 million in total out of a 2.3 million population, 6,000 people are going to, 6,000 are going to die by the time the World Cup is staged. Would feel like, oh my God, that's like unbelievably awful, right? However, one, it's a projection. Two, not all migrants who die at work. Three, it includes migrants like a second generation Indian accountant who's 63, who has a heart attack at his desk. This is more complex. You know, actually everybody's been playing fast and loose. On the other hand, you know, the Supreme Council for Delivery and Legacy, aka the organizing committee, is saying 3 people died on our sites. And it's like, yeah, but you know, there's the 34 that you say are non-work related deaths in a country where the whole system of recording deaths and medical investigations and coroner's reports until very recently been a complete disaster. You're only looking at the very top flight of World Cup projects that you directly control. And to be fair, you know, they have insisted on, you know, the stadiums in particular, the very, very highest sort of standards in Qatar, because they know the lens is on them. But then there's like the great big, you know, supply chains, what's going on there, and what's going on, you know, in the wider infrastructure projects, of which, of course, it's all sort of part and parcel. The figure's probably somewhere in the middle, you know, in the thousands maybe. But I kind of think it's partly, not that this is unimportant and not to dismiss it, but there's something, you've got to pull back and look at the bigger picture as well, which is like, how many people have had life-changing injuries? That's a huge thing. How many people have come and gone and never been paid? You know, there are all sorts of other, you know, really terrible transgressions of workers' rights alongside the deaths. And I think we need, you know, we've got slightly fixated on that. And, you know, remember, as big as those numbers are, this is from a population of 2 million people. So the Qataris have even argued that mortality rates, if you kind of compared what the mortality rates of the populations that are in Qatar were they at home, actually it wouldn't be that different. I'm not in a position to, I'm certainly not a sophisticated enough epidemiologist to be able to engage in that debate seriously. But yeah, that's where we are. And it's like, whatever the numbers, you know, the kafala system, which is also in operation in the rest of the Gulf, which is the private migration and labor market regulation system in the Gulf, you know, is a nightmare. The inequalities and injustices and abuses that result from it are obvious and awful. You know, when you have to have a personal, someone who's personally like your sponsor, who has control of your travel documents, decides if you can leave the country or not, decides if you can change a job or not, in a place where there's no trade unions, no legal redress, you can't possibly trust the police, etc., etc. And abuses have been widespread, and not just in, you know, World Cup projects, but like, imagine what the state of play for a lot of domestic workers is. Pretty grim. However, and this is always the case with Qatar, it is complex to make a really nuanced judgment, is that the kafala system has gone. In 2017, after various attempts to stave off more serious reform, they made an agreement with the ILO, International Labour Organization, that is part of the UN, who opened a Doha office, and they began a process to dismantle kafala and replace it with a kind of modernized, legalistic, bureaucratic, impersonal labour market regulation and migration visa system. And in 2020, they did that. And is it perfect? Is it Sweden? Like, is it fuck? You know, trade unions are banned. Legal redress is still pretty minimal. The inequalities, you know, of day-to-day life that make workers so vulnerable continues to persist. Implementation is always a huge problem in Qatar. You know, you can have a minimum wage and regulations around this and that, but unless people are checking. So all of that remains very much a question mark. And there are also people in Qatar who would like to get rid of it after the World Cup because they were making a lot of money out of the old system. There is, of course, a more progressive wing, including, I would say, the people who run the World Cup, who don't want to turn the clock back. And that's an interesting kind of internal Qatari conflict. So how are we to judge this? You know, well, we can say too little, too late. You know, it's very easy to be sort of moralistic, you know, finger wagging. And there is a place, I mean, a lot of people have died. It's been really miserable for so many people. On the other hand, you know, the claim is made that international sports events in closed and authoritarian societies open them up to international norms and force nudge a degree of progressive change. You know, that was the argument made certainly about Beijing 2008 and how we laughed. However, on this occasion, that is precisely what has happened. I mean, it's also a testament to a very effective campaign run by the NGOs. You know, they've been really on this. And a groundswell of support in a kind of more politicized global football culture has been supporting them. You know, the Norwegians backing them, the Danes are going to protest with their black in mourning third kit for workers, etc., etc. So I think, yeah, that's where we are with that. I mean, I would not choose to be a worker in the Gulf, and I am privileged and happy to say that that is not my fate. But were I to, I would not be going to Saudi Arabia. I'd be going to Qatar, for what it's worth. Environment. So again, it's a mixed story. You know, Qatar 2022 is the most, again, it's interesting how times change, critically examined for its environmental credentials in a way that no sporting mega event has ever been. There was a bit of this around Beijing 2018 and its artificial snow. But Russia 2018, you know, an insane carbon intensive event built on hydrocarbon money. Nobody was like, I didn't hear a damn thing. I didn't hear a damn thing sponsored by Gazprom. Qatar, you know, is being much more critically examined. The world has changed. The climate crisis moves on. The relationship between sport and climate is much sharper and much more in focus. And the Qataris, again, to their credit, and FIFA is part of this, have a much more substantial, serious environment policy than anyone's ever had before. And with that, of course, comes scrutiny, So we find on the one hand, some really serious efforts to invest in solar power, to dismantle stadiums, to have a vaguely plausible use for big stadiums that are going to be taken apart. I mean, they're quite good, actually, on a lot of that. And a massive, great offset program for all the carbon that will be burnt flying there. But then we find, inevitably, Carbon Watch comes along, Carbon Market Watch, and goes, "Oh, I think you've massively underestimated the emissions associated with building stadiums, and your offset program's incomplete." And like, really, renewable energy, people are going to do that anyway. This is just replacement. And that's a whole debate about whether offsets are kind of actually a meaningful and permissible and responsible way of dealing with this. So, Qatar, it's interesting. The Qataris have made, if other sporting events kind of went down their path, that would be a significant advance. On the other hand, in the cold light of day, we find how far they and everybody else is falling short of what needs to be done. I don't know. There's like, just in my guts, what I find in a way most troubling about Qatar is here we are in a place that's heating faster than anywhere else, literally on the earth, burning a lot of carbon at a time when there isn't much time left to play international football. Really? How much longer can we carry on doing this? And I don't know what the answer to that question is, but it troubles me, and I just put it out there. And it's what's interesting with Qatar, I suppose, for me, one of the other things that's interesting is that all of the reasons that people rightly criticize and admonish what the Qataris are up to, and their reliance on autocracy, hydrocarbons, etc., migrant labor, poor working conditions. It's like, football, wake up. What have you been doing for the last 20 years? Saudi Arabia at Newcastle, UAE at Manchester City and 9 other clubs, Gazprom sponsoring Schalke, Red Star Belgrade, FIFA, the Azerbaijani National Oil Company sponsoring Atletico Madrid, the Marathis at Inter were oil billionaires, all those people who wear shirts and kick footballs and boots where the workforce is getting less than 1% of the price that you paid for it. And we know the conditions. So I'm saying, like, that doesn't make Qatar's issues okay, but it is so much part of, like, actually, this is the world we all live in, and we're all part of. So I understand folks who want to personally boycott. That's fine. I don't have a problem. I don't, admonish them. I wonder whether it is better, A, to look, and B, in the end, if you really want to make a political statement about this, it's got to be collective.
Yeah.
Politics is like individual boycotts and whataboutery. It's like, this doesn't move shit, And I think this, of course, is one, a dilemma many people encounter. Like, what can I do? Where do I hang my hat? How do I square all of this? And, if there were more forms of collective action and organization, then that would be, but that the football world is struggling still, as indeed global civil society is, to find those ways of doing it. So again, certainly from the perspective of the interested sociologist, Qatar 2022 sure is a tournament for our times.
I taught a class this morning, David, about the lack of collective action. I mean, that wasn't what the class was meant to be about, but the students just, Black Lives Matter, they're thinking about that, and they're just they asked me to compare what's going on in the world today in terms of collective action to the 60s, and I was just like, there's no comparison. There's not that kind of collective action? I mean, I perhaps there would be collective action around the Qatar World Cup from fans or teams or something, and wearing black is not exactly the kind of thing I had in mind.
I mean, what does one have in mind? And it's all too late. I mean, it's like you want to organize stuff like we're in October. It's happening in 4 weeks. Politics takes time, takes organization. I mean, I think, myself, good for the Danes. And I think they're also punting up some money. And that's an interesting thing. I mean, that's somewhere where people could conceivably take their energy or their concern. Is that Amnesty said about 3 months ago, said, okay, you've made all these changes. We know there are still problems. And we know above all that a lot of folks who came to Qatar had to pay up basically bribes, illegal bribes to agents to get them there that leave them in sort of debt penury. So FIFA should put up 10% of its prize fund for money to compensate all of these folks, and the Qataris can pitch in as well. And I think let's back that. Yeah, good. Let's do that. Grand gestures and being cross are all very well, but nothing beats putting money in the pocket of people who've been ripped off. That would be an absolutely that's a legacy. Good. Let's do that. It doesn't make it perfect, but good. Let's do it. And it's not even that much money. We're talking about like $1 billion. That's like 1% of the less than 0.5% of the cost of the whole show. It's a FIFA $500 million. I mean, they could get away with a couple of 100 million. It's not a big deal in the scheme of things. Like their earnings, 6 billion is like the total income, maybe more on this one. So that's a place people can go. Get on Amnesty's website, check out what they're up to. Put your name to it.
Okay, great. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. I guess one thing I do want to point out, to echo you. I mean, you've mentioned China and Russia. And the European takeover of many of these great clubs by petrodollars. I also just want to make clear that anyone who's living in a Western industrialized society is obviously dependent on these industries, these laborers. I'm very concerned about this World Cup, but I don't want to suggest that I'm sitting here living some life that is not dependent on migrant workers. The food I eat and the clothes I wear, as much as I do my best, but nevertheless, we are all part of this system.
Yeah.
Sorry, go. You can go right ahead.
No, I'm just agreeing with you. The message of the Qatar World Cup is structural change and collective action, people.
Yes.
I mean, it's kind of like sociology of politics 101, but it's like individual gesture, and minor consumption alteration are all very well and have their place. But actually, if you really, what this shows is the depth of structural change required in the global economy, and the need for massive collective action. I mean, this is true. We know this from climate, and this is sure as hell true in football as well.
Well, this will bring me now to the Super League, because I was struck. I'm blanking the name of this guy. His name is Pete, but he said that when the Super League happened, there was grassroots resistance to it, and that to a certain extent shut it down. And there was no such thing with the Qatar World Cup. There was, the possibility, as you say, it's too late. Well, we've known about this World Cup for a long time. The collective action happened almost overnight with the Super League, and nothing happened with the World Cup that I know of. And that just, I don't have an answer for why that is, but it just seems like we've reached a point where we believe there's nothing we can do about it. And I think people were surprised that they were able to do something about the Super League.
In the case of the Super League, I mean, all the protests came from England. So it's not really Italy. The Italians and Spanish weren't part of it. And in England, it's about the mobilization of club identities, isn't it?
Yeah.
And networks of fans. And of course, actually, despite the scale of commercialization and policing of football stadiums, they remain a place where spontaneous grassroots collective organization and collective action is the norm. That's partly why we go, because we go to experience that and be part of it. So people are very well aware of their own kind of potential and have pre-existing networks, both formal and informal, of friendship, season ticket blocks, formal fan organizations, etc. That means in an instant, bang, you can put people on the street and do stuff. And I think what really riled people is the whole relegation promotion thing. I mean, English football likes to, it likes to kid itself that Bristol Rovers, under the right circumstances, really could make it to the top, and that, the mighty really can fall given, and of course, it's a sort of touching belief in social mobility that doesn't really bear much relation to the world, but there it is. It's a kind of utopian hope, and that's I think that really got people's goat. So in some ways it's not surprising, and at Manchester United, where probably some of the biggest protests were, and you actually had a pitch invasion and a game cancellation, this draws on 15 years of sporadic struggle with the Glazers. You had a huge fight and protests like that when the Glazers took over in 2005. You've had the green and gold stuff over the years. There are people who are ready to have, and organized and up for it already. And, add in the Super League's, obvious kind of awfulness, that you can see how it would trigger those kind of reactions.
Yeah, I think we'll have to leave it here because we're running out of time. I remain very interested in football's potential as one of the few places where grassroots organizing does and still can exist. And then, at least as an American, I have watched American finance billionaires, Middle Eastern and Russian petro billionaires, and then a variety of media moguls and just unsavory types from Europe take over the game. And I would love a grassroots restoration. It seems like that's the dream that must remain if we're going to continue to love football. And yet I don't see that coming on the near horizon. I would love it if you could tell me it was.
Well, what I would say is that, we probably could have said something similar 25 years ago, albeit mainly about local millionaires and, more local and national unsavory characters, rather than the sort of particular configuration of the global super rich that we're now dealing with. But at that point, we literally would have had nowhere to look for signs of collective organization and resistance. And I think over the last 25 years, that's emerged. I mean, certainly in England, where the Football Supporters Association has actually proved to be a very effective lobbying and mobilizing organization on a variety of issues, where dominant narratives about the game, are now being challenged by a much more interesting critical press, both mainstream and on social media, where you have much more widespread forms of fan organization that are kind of orientated a bit towards governance rather than, fighting. We have a much expanded network of fan-owned clubs or part fan-owned clubs, and that's not just in England, but also in Scotland, in Croatia, in Poland. Germany remains its 50+1 model and alternative. And then across, the range of social movements on, issues of race, disability, gender, sexuality, environment, there is now a presence in football of athlete activists, campaigning networks, information organizations, and of course it's uneven, like Some places this is not happening at all. Some places, it's all happening. But it's out there. Like I said, it's a very fragile archipelago, and it's not all connected up. But football remains a place, as you say, where people value the collective, the collective goal, a sense of sort of justice and inclusivity that has a kind of reach in an era where most political ideologies have lost a lot of grasp on the general public consciousness and imagination, remains a place in which some of these things can be learned and rekindled. So, man, as you know, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. What else are we going to do?
All right. Thank you, David. That's a wonderful place to leave it. Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.